back at the courthouse where about 48 hours ago, Alex Mashinsky was sentenced and eventually received 12 years imprisonment. Alex freely walked in with his wife and I believe her stepfather and a fourth gentleman who claims to be a victim of Alex Mashinsky but flew up presumably from Miami specifically to talk about how much he appreciates Alex.
Hi Celsians, this is Santos from beautiful Miami, Florida. I wanted to share a few thoughts with you.
There were about a dozen of us, creditors/victims in attendance, which I think the low turnout is likely because we had such delays in the sentencing. You'll recall because Alex hired the same defense counsel as was representing Sam Bankman-Fried, that his trial was delayed from late 2024 to, at first it was going to be April of this year, and then it got pushed to May 8th. It was on the 14th floor, which is in contrast to Sam, which was in front of Judge Kaplan on the 21st floor. But the layout is identical.
The judiciary was unsurprisingly located at the head of the room. There are two banks of progressively elevated desks. Judge Codall would take his seat at the highest, as if he's on top of the mountaintop. There was a court official in the row in front of him and the court stenographer, and then off to the side were three of the judge's clerks. The jury box was off to the right of the room, but it was empty other than a woman who I believe was the court sketch artist. The prosecution took the first of two rows of desks before the court. The prosecution's team consisted of both attorneys from the Department of Justice and an FBI agent. Most notable for the prosecution was Allison Nichols, who spoke on their behalf. The defense was directly behind the prosecution, and in order from right to left, we had attorneys Mark McCasey, Michael Westfall, Tori Young, Alex Mashinsky, the defendant, and one of their analysts in the leftmost chair. The Mashinsky delegation was in the foremost row of the gallery. Present were Chrissy Mashinsky, her koala attorney, Lee Nathanson, and an older gentleman I believe to be Chrissy's stepfather. Myself and other creditors were in the row directly behind Chrissy. Also notable, Matthew Lee from Inner City Press, who was live tweeting the sentencing, was located on the right in one of the rear seats of the gallery.
Proceedings began with Judge Codall going over the sentencing guidelines. Because he is viewed as a first-time offender, it would get the lowest 1-point level, but because the size of this fraud was over $550 million, it becomes the most serious offense. The parole office composes what's known as a pre-sentencing report, or PSR, that confirms all the facts of the case that the judge will then rule on. So both the defense and the prosecution will submit information for this PSR to be written. And the defense, you'll remember that Alex pled guilty to 2 criminal counts, one of securities fraud and one of commodities fraud. And they were claiming that he made only 2 misstatements in the entire 5-year period, which is ludicrous. And it's offensive to pretend that somehow there were only 2 misstatements in this entire litany of fraud and deceit that he engaged in. So they objected to pretty much everything in the entire PSR. And it's just like, you're pleading guilty, but you're protesting your innocence. Why? It feels like a miscalculation. The defense began after Judge Codall finished his remarks, and they took it in stages. McCasey passed it off to Tori Young. She brought up the metaphor of if everybody's blindfolded around the elephant, they're going to get a different impression about what the elephant is. So they might feel the tail and think it's a rope, feel the side and think it's a wall. We all just have different impressions because we don't have enough information on what a wonderful person her client is. The attempt to minimize the damage is unreal. I'd planned to speak as one of the victims. Effectively, at that moment, I realized it was going to be just in response to all the nonsense that the defense is spewing at this point. The defense had acknowledged only $590 million worth of losses, which is obviously a massive understatement. But she basically compared that $590 million amount, which the prosecution was willing to do because Anything over 550 is the max amount for sentencing purposes, so why bother? If they're willing to acknowledge 590, there's a margin for error, whatever. But in terms of the actual facts, like, that's a crazy underestimate. So they're using that 590 that they've admitted to and claiming against the peak assets under management that it represented like a 2% loss. Claiming that this was a 2% loss is so offensive. They claimed that the damage had been largely remediated, which again, completely untrue. There are people that may never recover what they lost in terms of their quality of life, and you can't remediate the experiences that creditors have suffered through in this case. And really, there's been no attempt from the Mashinskys to make right on these things. Tori Young hands over the stage to her partner, Michael Westfall, who begins with this really ludicrous intro where he's like, "Your Honor, it's been the privilege of my career to represent Alexander Mashinsky." What kind of career are we talking about here? I mean, he seems like a nice enough guy, but I mean, way to just totally embarrass yourself. We get this whole spiel about how Alex doesn't have a malicious bone in his body and he's just this wonderful guy. And if you didn't know about the case, you'd be like, wow, this seems like a really great guy. Like, let's let him go. Like, why has he been framed here? Like, it's just absolutely insane. And just, I think collectively, if you're a creditor in that courtroom, your blood pressure is just rising because it's just total gaslighting. The defense was claiming that there was no, they paid out $1.5 billion in rewards and those were all real. They had claimed that somehow Celsius was not a hoax, but the claim that Celsius was fake was a hoax. It's like just really odd claims. Like, in what sense have you paid out $1.5 billion in rewards if you've destroyed people's principles by billions of dollars more? Like, that doesn't fly. Casey concludes, and he talks again about how wonderful Alex is and how he's been writing a book about gravity and how, I mean, even Mark McCasey can't comprehend these advanced topics that Alex is talking about. It's way over all our heads because he's such a brilliant man. I'm sure it's all original scientific research and not ghost-written like his previous book. They're telling this tale about how Alex is really this amazing person, how he, was this refusenik from Ukraine. He went to Israel, studied, was a military veteran, came to the U.S., employed all these people, did a wonderful job, had an unblemished record, and then how he tried to save us all in bankruptcy. When, I mean, in reality, in bankruptcy, he was just looking to keep the reins of power. There's no indication that he did anything other than look out for himself. The defense was saying that Alex took all these steps to help customers. So he was claiming that Alex was behind the bankruptcy plan and that he gets credit for trying to make sure we get our coins back. But the fact is that he's responsible for losing half of the coins remaining when they filed for bankruptcy. As the first coin report showed, they were missing over half of the in-kind assets. And despite the protestations of his 20-year friend David Barse, who was on the special committee appointed by Alex, who claimed that Alex was responsible, commitment to friendship is laudable, but Barse has been offensive with how he's characterized this fraud. He in the past has blamed market condition for being behind it, and that's just simply not the case.
How did all this happen?
You had, the so-called crypto winter last year, and you saw this sort of massive unwind, if you will. And it's not just Celsius, but obviously many, many other participants in the digital asset space have experienced their own demise.
Celsius lost tons of money. They lied about it. They hid it from their customers. And eventually the market conditions revealed those facts after people were leaving the platform. It was revealed they didn't have the funds. So you can blame the market conditions for being the catalyst for discovery of the fraud, but it was not the underlying cause. And really, shame on anybody who's claiming that that's the case. Mark McCasey brought up that in one of his past roles, he encountered a poor homeless person outside of his office, and he took it upon himself to offer this homeless person a job at his company. And It was meant to instill a sense of, wow, this guy is very generous. He's looking out for the little people. But in some ways, it felt more like this is what the Celsius hiring practice was. There were people literally emailing him out of the blue and getting job offers with very little rigor in terms of evaluating the skill set of these employees.
He's like, what are you doing here? I was like, I don't know. And kind of just stalked Celsius until he hired me. I said, I don't know if I have the qualifications. And you said, A students work for B students, B students work for C students, and D students run the companies. You can do whatever you want. That's what you said, like word for word. So
a lot of key employees just reached out to Alex. That includes Oren Blonstein, the head of innovation, includes early stage employee Wasim Shabut, who also just reached out of the blue. Our friend and co-host of the AMA, Zach Wilds, just showed up at a conference and helped assemble the booth. And they said, this is exactly what we're looking for. We're going to bring this guy on. The reality is that Alex surrounded himself with people that could not help him prevent causing this catastrophe. He conned Westcap into investing hundreds of millions of dollars, being the lead Series B investor. And Westcap, as a condition of making this investment, wanted to professionalize the staff at Celsius, which is a pretty reasonable thing to demand. So they brought on Rod Bolger from some Canadian bank and Chris Ferraro. They were part of the Westcap professionalization. And the defense is using their credentials as if Alex was, going to be credited with, they had all these amazing employees. Like these employees were brought in because of Westcap wanting them brought in. Alex has a chance to address the court, and the waterworks are maybe going. It's unclear. He's presenting as if he's emotionally suffering, which is uncomfortable to see, even if it's a villain that's suffering. Judge Kodal asks him if he needs more time to compose himself, and he's like, no, Your Honor, it's not going to get better. It's almost like I'm trying to keep this act up, and I don't want to conjure up more tears later. It would be a cynical way of interpreting it, but not unfair. And he kind of just meanders through. The judge actually procedurally asked him to confirm that he acknowledged the pre-sentencing report. So Alex acknowledges that he has no further objections to the PSR, which is clever from Judge Kodal to make sure that there are not going to be any complications. Alex, you'll remember, has waived his right to appeal. Procedurally wanted to make sure there were no grounds for him to violate his word, which I'm sure he would be anxious to do at any available opportunity. He is having trouble going through his statement. It could be that maybe it is sinking in that he is going to be going to prison, but at this time he doesn't know how long for. It feels like it was a bid for sympathy from the judge. I think he said that he was trying to help his customers and do all this great stuff, but he failed us. Which, yeah, but you haven't admitted to all the lying and fraud. And it's undeniable. We mentioned the ICO. Equities First was a huge, huge problem. So you have a $500 million hole. Alex's defenders will point towards Equities First as a major factor in the insolvency. And that's true. But they're forgetting that Celsius has an obligation to inform their customers. This type of financial damage, you need to tell people about. Rather than announce this very serious problem, what they wound up doing was claiming that, okay, we're not borrowing from you, Equities First. You're going to be borrowing from us, but uncollateralized. So they just rewrote the loans going the other way and treated them as if they were totally intact at par value, which again is fraud because their own internal reports suggested that they would only get 10 to 15 cents on the dollar back on those loans. So that's a massive impairment. You're talking at least $400 million. This is something that he was very aware of, and he hid. We then transitioned to Allison Nichols for the prosecution, and she went over the highlights of the prosecution sentencing memorandum, which was strong. It goes through everything that Alex did wrong, which takes a while. It hits chiefly on the two counts. We have the securities and commodities fraud. So the securities fraud was based on him claiming that he wasn't selling Cell Token, but he was, And then the commodities fraud was based on disclosures he'd made of Celsius being delta neutral in terms of the market, which were both false, obviously. So he had admitted to that, and it expanded on all the other things that he did wrong. So there's, I think it's a 97-page report that they put out. Some of the highlights from it, this guy is so unreal. They were talking about Cell Token, and he was being encouraged to add utility by his employees to this token. And he's just saying, F utility. And then at a later point, there was some regulatory concern that legal was pushing back on, and he says, F legal. And he's not censoring himself. Just complete disrespect for protocol and common sense. There was a lot that Alison Nichols covered, and she made clear, like, the government does not request a 20-year sentence lightly, and that it's warranted in this case. And she brought up the lack of contrition is really a major factor in this. Like, he's seems to not understand or take responsibility for what he's done. How can you be sorry for something when you deny the reality of what you've done? And it's really a problem as well, because there are some former customers of Celsius who are still in denial, and they're looking to this person that they look up to and his denials, and they're using that as a basis for their own denial of reality. So it's doing everyone a disservice to not come forward and actually be straight up with us. We took a break for lunch at that point, and then the victim statements began. There were 5 of us speaking as victims, and by luck of the draw, I was brought up first. And I'm actually glad for that, because if I had been later, I probably would have been focused on what I was going to say versus being able to listen to all the other victims. I've never spoken at a criminal trial before, so it's something new. It's an interesting experience. I actually find speaking out here on the street harder than speaking in court, because there's so many distractions. There's some dude passed out on a bench behind me. There's people doing pull-ups in the park here. So there's a lot more going on, versus in the court, you're able to speak in peace and quiet. The 2 main things I wanted to touch upon were, in the plan administrator's latest report, there was a section that talked about deceased creditors, and there are 231 of us who have passed away in this wait for justice. And that was a point that I really wanted to hit upon, because there's a lot of suffering here. And it's not to say that these deaths are directly attributable to the fraud, but it obviously is not going to help, right? Like, your quality of life is going to be diminished if you don't have the funds that you were relying on Celsius. So, the fact that many of us have passed away over the 3 years waiting for justice, I think, is also just a powerful indicator of how unfair this process is, where he's still, to this day, in his fancy multi-million-dollar penthouse just uptown here, while creditors are still picking up the pieces of their financial lives all over the world. And it really did demand a harsh sentence. The things that the defense was saying also about how Alex had given all this great advice about how, you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. Celsius Network was based upon the concept of holding assets on the platform and being able to live off the interest. So that was part of the Mashinsky method that he kept preaching about. It was actually a book that he was planning to write prior to this book on gravity that we learned about. So those were kind of the 2 points that I absolutely wanted to hit. I know the Intercity Press was doing a live tweet, so I don't know to what degree the offensiveness of how the defense portrayed this came through, but being in the courthouse, it is infuriating to hear people just outright lying about what they're, like, it's not just puffery, it's just outright lying in terms of the scope of what their client did. How, like, this elephant, everybody, if they're blindfolded, would get a different impression of what's really there. And we didn't have the right impression of Alex Mashinsky. So my opening was to point out, like, what the defense has said is completely at odds with reality and the scope of harm that has occurred here. And that this elephant, if there is an elephant and the elephant was Celsius, then the defense is at the opposite end of the elephant. And us, the customers, are at the tusk end. And we've all been gored by the elephant. And I left the metaphor there, but if you were to extend it, and I don't know if Judge Kodal did, but if the defense is at the opposite end from us and we're at the Tusk end, it might suggest that the defense is making shit up. Some foul language, unfortunately, crept in here. 2% is such an underestimate here. Like my own returns, I recovered, like my APY on Celsius was negative 100%, in excess of negative 100, because I was a late to join customer. And to compare the negative 100% APY reality with a 2% that the defense is putting out there is just unreal. And people that held crypto on the platform have recovered maybe 40% back in kind or less, depending on if they had Bitcoin only or other assets that had appreciated. So I had mentioned that Mr. Mukasey had brought up the book on gravity that Alex was writing, but that he doesn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation because they've just been minimizing everything so much. And that the book he had written previously was the Mashinsky method. And the idea of the Mashinsky method is that you would be able to live on your savings, which is an invitation to put as much of your money as possible on the platform to earn the yield necessary to fund your living expenses. It's clear that you are inviting people to put at risk funds that they should not have exposed to this level of risk. And the fact that the losses had already occurred and he was concealing them is, again, fraud. And that should be the fraud that he's charged with. The losses that he hid and concealed from his customers, to me, is the driving fraud here versus the counts of securities and commodities fraud, which are just, to me, it's more window dressing around the actual harm that he inflicted on everybody. I think around this point, I had mentioned how he's saying that he's reaching out to all his customers and looking out for us, and how he's trying to attend a wedding later this month. And I brought up the 231 creditors that had passed away. And I turned to him and asked him, like, how many of our funerals have you gone to? You want to go to a wedding? How many of your funerals have you gone to? Like, you said you want to speak to us. When I invited, I'm addressing him directly, when I invited you to a conversation in December of 2022, I can put the tweet up here on when I cut this back up later, he just blocked me. So, like, and I know Doug Stringer also invited him to a conversation and had a similar result. The people who had critical feedback for just cause were blocked. The only people he talked to were people that were part of his cult, his fan club. And that is not leadership. That's not being honest in terms of saying that you're in communication with your victims. What he actually meant was, I think, that he was in communication with people like Santos Caceres, who was a Celsius ambassador who still loves Celsius, who entered the courthouse with the Mashinsky delegation and then left with them through the subway. So this guy, apparently, I think he's based in Miami, flew up here specially for this. He's going back with the Mashinskys. Is he sleeping on their couch or being put up in a hotel? Who knows? But he actually was a victim that spoke third, and he's like, I'm a victim. I lost all this on Celsius. Or lost this, he didn't disclose how much. But then he goes on to say about like how great the recoveries are and how like even stablecoin people are doing really great. And like I got shares in Ionic Digital and they're amazing, and like really just an embarrassment. Like, how are you squaring you're a victim and you seem to be celebrating your victimhood? And meanwhile, Chase has organized this get-together with creditors, and like, nope, not interested in that. I'm just gonna go with Mashinsky here. Like, absolutely unreal. But everyone who came out, all the creditors were great. It was interesting that Alex, with all the waterworks that were there earlier, he was staring daggers right at me, and it didn't seem like he was very friendly, right? So the fact that he's going to put on these fake tears and then look not particularly happy when I'm speaking kind of gives the game away. One of their children had written a letter in defense of their father, claiming that Alex had not done, quote, anything severe, which I found very offensive because it is. And it's not anything particularly against the child himself, so much as the fact that this shows the Mashinskys would have proofread this letter, they would have run it through their defense counsel, and they obviously would have taught their child that their dad hadn't done anything severe. So they're being dishonest within their own household. And they don't take this seriously. They don't think that what Alex did is his fault. And that is the most infuriating thing about Alex Mashinsky, is his continual denial and gaslighting. It's really just nonstop. The fact that he claimed only 2 misstatements, I brought up that in any given AMA, you could look at the prosecution's exhibits on the corrections to the AMAs, and he was making well over 2 misstatements per hour in those AMAs. So the fact that he was claiming only 2 misstatements over 5 years is just absolute fantasy land. You can't describe adequately the scope of harm that this has inflicted on the victims, which is why it's so disappointing that the defense focused so much on how this is going to be harmful for Alex. None of their papers actually mention victims by name, except for the people writing letters for leniency that the defense submitted. There were 41 letters submitted from friends and family, and also Celsius creditors who haven't figured out, apparently, what Alex Mashinsky is all about. So there's, I think, a variety of psychological mechanisms at play where people can't come to terms that this man has perpetrated this level of harm. David spoke next, and David also seized on the elephant metaphor. He did a good job of being clear and concise about the scope of the fraud here. And then we had the Santos embarrassment. And then Hugh went next, who is another creditor based locally. And actually my favorite moment of the entire sentencing occurred when he was speaking. So Hugh had claimed that Alex had never said sorry, which is fair, especially prior to Thursday, because he never really apologized. In his own speech, he had said sorry, like mumbling a few times. Mark McCasey, the attorney, like has this angry look on his face, and he turns to Michael Westfall. He's like, he said sorry like 6 effing times already today. And like you tell, he's just like upset. Clearly their tactic was to try to make him be as sympathetic as possible. But the fact that, again, he couldn't admit what he did, it doesn't matter very much. Again, if you're sorry, but you don't admit to what you did, then you're not sorry. You're still lying. And Hollis finished up for us. He kind of took an industry-wide view, but said, Alex does need to be held accountable because of the seriousness of this crime and how it affected his own family. So it was very useful that we had so many victim impact statements, because particularly when held against the 41 letters that were written in defense, the 200 plus letters made a difference. Like if we hadn't written those letters, then it could have created an impression that maybe this isn't as serious as it is, because the only people speaking out are the people in his defense. I mean, they did, I'll say, a good job in gaslighting, but thankfully not good enough. So the judge goes through the sentencing guidelines once more and asked if there were any objections to the characteristics in the guidelines. There are a couple of things that he said that stand out to me in terms of understanding the sentence. So he had mentioned the gulf of years difference between the 20-year minimum that the prosecution had asked for and the 1 year and 1 day that the defense was asking for. And he said where to draw the line. So it seems like he was effectively attempting to compromise between the two positions. And he had mentioned that it's a matter of applying the minimum amount necessary for the seriousness of the crime. So it had previously also been said that if not for the plea agreement, the scope of damages would warrant a life sentence. Because of the plea agreement, the max was then reduced to 30 years. So there's no question that this is a horribly serious crime that was perpetrated. He used kind of those attributes to arrive at his 12-year sentence. I think it's clear that there's a lot of disappointment that he only got 12 years, but there's nobody more disappointed than Alex Mashinsky. It didn't seem like he was expecting to get that many years. I think he thought that he had done enough to get more like a 4 to 6 year sentence, would be my suspicion. And he was asked if he had any final words before the sentencing, the 12 years was confirmed by the judge. And he stammered something about how he was only acting on information that was available to him. Like, basically, like, I didn't do anything wrong intentionally. It's just, this is the information available, and I did, my best, is kind of effectively what he's getting at. And then he goes and says that no other employee has come forward to admit their role in the wrongdoing. So effectively, it's almost like, wow, he's being really honorable, as if he voluntarily came forward and wasn't arrested. The fact that other people are also responsible doesn't change the fact that Alex Mashinsky is chiefly responsible. That's, the chief in the CEO, there is culpability there, another C word. Any C-level officer really should, by default, be accountable for the crimes that the company commits. And you have to have procedures in place to make sure that your company isn't committing these crimes. So I'm just a total lack of accountability. His attorney had previously requested that he not be confined in MDC Brooklyn, which is where Diddy and SBF were held. Apparently it's not so nice, and they did some research and found that there's Otisville in upstate New York, which is apparently kind of cushy. So they requested that, and the judge said he would be willing to write a letter of recommendation for Otisville, which again, funny name for a prison considering the relationship with one of the most famous customers of Celsius that also is a huge fan of Mashinsky. That was pretty much it for the case. And again, there wasn't any attempt from Alex to engage with any of the creditors there. I don't think he particularly cares about any of us. It would have been wise for him, I think, to at least feign caring, but he couldn't be bothered, so he just left in the subway, tried to get away from Chase as quickly as possible. And Santos was with him, his little Celsius ambassador friend. 12 years is certainly less than what the crime warrants, but being a first-time offender in the eyes of the PSR, the pre-sentencing report, played a huge role. And there's a little bit of misinformation, I think, about, I saw on Twitter that people were saying that because he was a military veteran in the IDF, that's why he got a lenient sentence. I don't think that played really much of a role at all. The judge did cite that, but he's really just reading through what the defense had advanced as favorable attributes for Mashinsky. If he had been conductor in an orchestra or some famous painter, those would have also been used. It's just he happened to be an IDF officer. The judge is just giving color to why, these are the positive attributes. But I think it mostly came down to being a first offender here. So he's free until September 12th, when he should turn himself in. We'll see if he has anything up his sleeve. He's going to be out in Nashville later this month at a wedding. Will he reach out to any creditors that are not already his fans? I think really one thing that would go a long way would be if he agreed to sit down for an interview for Chase's documentary and just explain himself and allow himself and his ridiculous clown narrative to be challenged. Could he do that? I don't think he has the courage, personally. He lives in delusion and fantasy, and it took him this far in life, but ultimately was his downfall. It's just sad. Like, it's really a miscalculation on his part that he played it this way, because I think had he come clean and admitted to lying countless times, rather than saying, oh, it was the market and my employees let me down, but I had all these good intentions, I like to do good and do well, rather than maintain that posture, it's obvious he was aware of all the misdeeds. Had he admitted that, I think it would have gone a long way. And I think, to me, you could spin a tale where, like, yes, Your Honor, I lied about so-and-so, but I was trying to make things right, and I knew that if I told people about these losses, then the game would be up and I wouldn't be able to save things. But everything I tried only made things worse, and I didn't know how to save it, and I got caught, and I'm so sorry. I was so wrong. Like, that's believable. I would buy that. And at least at that point, he's acknowledging what he did, and we could move on. Had he come clean, it would be easier for everybody to have closure. It was great to get some time with creditors. So sorry I missed out on Simon Spaces, but I wanted to be there in person with fellow creditors because it's so rare to get the chance to talk to people that have been through this, and really great people. I think everybody was in good spirits, even though there certainly is a sense that he deserved more. Again, I'll say nobody was more disappointed in the sentence than Alex Mashinsky. He certainly deserves every minute in that prison, and I hope he uses it wisely, because I think, like's been said on Twitter, were he to try to apologize to each of his victims, that itself would be a mammoth undertaking if he was doing it sincerely. I think the calculation was if he spent 10 minutes apologizing to each of his 600,000 customers, it would take well over 40 years. He's caused a lot of harm, more than I think he could ever possibly repair. That doesn't mean he shouldn't try. The rest of his life has to be penance. It was, I think, a solemn day overall, and it's not really like you can celebrate somebody being put away for double-digit years, but it's better to have that solemn result than to have the outrage if he was getting single digits. I do have a poll up about doing a video essay. It looks like Ionic Digital is in the lead, so over the next couple weeks, I think I'll be looking into just talking about the history of Ionic Digital, how we got here. I've kind of been trying to not think about Ionic, so it'll be good to assemble those ideas together. Thanks for catching this, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.